I set the audit report on the conference table like I was placing a card in a poker game I had already won. My hands were steady, my voice was calm. My sister Renata Souza sat across from me with our parents on either side of her, and she smiled at me the way she had been smiling at me our entire lives, like I was still the one who didn't quite belong in the room. That smile. I had been thinking about that smile for 14 months. I had been building the thing that would erase that smile for 14 months. And when I looked at our father, Dario Souza, and slid the first page across the polished wood toward him, I watched his eyes travel down the columns of numbers and I thought, this is the moment everything changes, not because I wanted to destroy my sister, but because she had already destroyed something that could not be rebuilt, and she had done it while I was in a hospital bed holding my newborn daughter, exhausted and trusting and completely unaware. She had looked at everything our parents built, everything I had helped build, and she had decided it belonged to her. $647,000, not in one move. In dozens of small ones over 18 months, each transaction small enough to feel like noise, each one adding to a pattern so clear that when our auditor, Teodoro Mancini, pulled the final report, he called me before he called anyone else. He said, and I remember this exactly, he said, Valentina, I need you to sit down before I tell you what I found. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I genuinely appreciate every single person who takes time to sit with this story. Go ahead and drop your city in the comments. I love seeing where people are watching from. This is one of those stories I have been carrying for a long time, and I want to tell it the right way, which means starting at the beginning. Because if I just show you the ending, my sister sitting across from me with that audit report in front of her, our parents watching, the attorney on the phone, you would see justice, but you would not understand the weight of it. You would not understand what it cost. And this story is very much about what things cost. So let me take you back. Let me take you to the beginning of something I did not see coming, told by someone who thought she knew her own family. My name is Valentina Souza Reyes. I am 38 years old. I was born in Porto Alegre and grew up in Sao Paulo before my parents brought us to the United States when I was 11, my sister Renata was 9, and my brother Keo was 14. My father, Dario Souza, built a commercial cleaning and facilities management company over 22 years, starting with a single contract at a shopping center in New Jersey and growing it to a regional operation with contracts across 4 states, a fleet of vehicles, and a permanent staff of over 160 people. My mother, Yolanda Souza, kept the books for the first 12 years and then transitioned into the administrative side, managing vendor relationships and compliance. The company was called Souza Facilities Group, and it was the thing my father talked about at every dinner, every holiday, every birthday. It was the 5th member of our family, the most important one if you ask my father honestly. I joined the company officially when I was 26 after finishing my MBA at Rutgers. Before that, I had worked summers and weekends in every department my father would let me into, starting with data entry at 16 and moving through accounts receivable, operations scheduling, client services, and finally contract management. By the time I joined full-time, I was not a novice being handed a title. I was someone who had spent a decade learning the machine. My father gave me the role of director of operations, which meant I oversaw the daily functioning of every contract, every team lead, every service schedule across all 4 states. It was not a small job. It was functionally the job that kept the company running. Renata had joined 2 years before me, at 22, coming in right out of her undergraduate degree in business administration. My father gave her the title of financial manager, which meant she handled accounts payable, payroll, vendor invoicing, and banking relationships. She did not have her CPA. She did not have a finance background beyond her undergraduate coursework. What she had was my father's complete and absolute trust, which was its own kind of currency in our family. Renata had always been the one who made my father laugh. She was charming in a specific way that worked beautifully on him, warm, attentive, always ready with the right question, always seeming like she was hanging on every word. My father called her his little executive. He said it with such pride that it became part of the family vocabulary, the way certain phrases do. She was his little executive. I was his workhorse. I heard that one too, delivered always with equal pride, though the energy was different. A workhorse is something you use, an executive is something you admire. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I loved my sister, not in a complicated, conditional way. I loved her straightforwardly, as a person loves a sibling they have shared a life with. We had inside jokes that dated back 20 years. We had a language built from childhood experiences and shared references. When she went through her divorce at 29, I was the person she called at 2 in the morning, and I was the person who drove 40 minutes to sit with her on her living room floor while she cried. I am telling you this because what comes later is not a story about 2 sisters who always hated each other. It is a story about someone I trusted completely and what that person chose to do with that trust. My husband, Marco Reyes, was not involved in the family business. He ran his own construction project management firm and had enough sense to keep a healthy distance from the dynamics of the Souza family enterprise. He watched, he was supportive, but he always said, and I always dismissed this, that any business where family relationships substitute for professional structures will eventually crack along the family lines. I thought he was being cynical. I was wrong. He was being perceptive. My daughter Isabella was born in April of 2022. She was our first child, arrived after 2 difficult years of trying, and her birth was simultaneously the most joyful and most physically demanding experience of my life. I was in labor for 21 hours. I had complications postpartum that kept me in the hospital for 4 days and at home for 3 weeks before I could properly function. I had arranged a maternity leave of 16 weeks, which I had structured carefully with transition plans for every operational responsibility I held. I had documented procedures. I had trained my deputy, a man named Horacio Vega, who had been with the company for 8 years and whom I trusted implicitly. I had briefed everyone. I had done everything right. The one area I had not covered, the one area I had not even thought to cover, was my sister's department. She did not report to me. She reported to my father, and my father during those 16 weeks was occupied with an expansion project in Connecticut that consumed most of his attention, which meant Renata was, for the first time in the company's history, operating almost entirely without oversight. I did not know that until much later. At the time, I was home with my daughter. I was exhausted and happy and focused on the magnificent, terrifying work of keeping a new human being alive. I was not thinking about vendor invoices or bank reconciliations. I was not thinking about anything except Isabella and recovery and the daily miracle of watching someone become a person. That was the window. 16 weeks, 4 months, that was all she needed. One thing I will say about those early months at home, Marco kept telling me I needed to rest, actually rest, and stop checking my work email. I managed about 3 days of that before the pull of the company was too strong. But I was only looking at operations data, scheduling, contract performance, team reports. The financial side of the house was not in my view. I trusted it. I trusted her. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what that silence feels like. You know what it is to watch someone underestimate you and choose to say nothing, not because you are weak, but because you are already doing the math. The first thing that felt wrong was not a number. It was a tone. Renata came to see Isabella when she was 6 weeks old. This was not unusual. She was the doting aunt, genuinely so. She held the baby with confidence. She brought gifts. She cooed and photographed and did everything an aunt is supposed to do. But at one point she stood in my kitchen making coffee and she said, without turning around, "Pappy is thinking about bringing in an outside CFO." I remember I was sitting at the kitchen table feeding Isabella and I looked up. "What?" She turned then. Her expression was careful. "He mentioned it to me last week. He thinks the company is getting big enough that we need a professional in the financial seat." I said, "That makes sense. It's been something we've needed for a while." She set her mug down very deliberately. "I just thought you should know in case it affects your role when you come back." I looked at her for a moment. The baby made a small sound. "Why would a CFO affect my role? I'm in operations." "I just mean structurally. The reporting lines might shift. Pappy has ideas." She smiled, picked up her coffee, and moved on to asking about my recovery. I thought about that conversation for 2 days. Not obsessively, but steadily, the way you turn something over when it doesn't quite make sense. Renata had never shown territorial instincts about her financial role before. She had always seemed more interested in the relational side of the business, the lunches with vendors, the family dinners where she could talk about the company as a legacy. She did not, historically, care much about structure or reporting lines, so why was she flagging a potential CFO hire to me? What was the message underneath the message? I filed it. I did not act on it. I had a 6-week-old and a body still healing from childbirth, and I made the decision to let it sit. This was, in retrospect, one of the few moments in this story where I wish I had moved faster. 6 weeks later, Renata called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and I could tell from the first syllable that she was in performance mode, that particular warmth she deployed when she wanted something to land a certain way. She said our father was thinking about restructuring some of the vendor contracts, that it was an efficiency thing, and that she had been handling it on his behalf. Did I want to weigh in? I said yes, of course, send me the details. She said she would. She never did. I followed up twice by text. Both times she responded with a variation of soon, just finalizing things, don't worry about it while you're on leave. I took that at face value. I was 3 months postpartum. I had a daughter who was just learning to smile. I chose to trust my sister. The inciting incident, the moment I now mark as the beginning, happened on a Friday afternoon in late July of 2022. I was 11 weeks into my maternity leave. Isabella was asleep in the other room. I was sitting at my desk at home, going through emails I'd been letting pile up when I noticed something small and strange in a forwarded message from Horacio. He had sent me an operational summary, routine, nothing alarming, but attached to it was a vendor invoice that had been CC'd to him by mistake. The invoice was from a company called Pacific Meridian Supplies, billed to Souza Facilities Group for $38,000 for, quote, specialized cleaning equipment and consumables, Northern Region Contract Fulfillment. I did not recognize the vendor name. In 14 years of working in and around that company, I had learned the roster of our vendors the way you learn the names of people in your neighborhood. We had a supply chain that had been built over 2 decades. We had preferred suppliers with negotiated rates. We had a vendor approval process. Pacific Meridian Supplies was not a name I had ever encountered. I flagged it in my mind and sent Horacio a quick message asking if he knew anything about this vendor. He wrote back within an hour, no, he had never heard of them. The invoice had come through a different channel. He had assumed I knew about it. I pulled up our company vendor database on my remote access login. Pacific Meridian Supplies was in the system, with an approval date of June 3rd of 2022, 6 weeks into my maternity leave. The authorization signature in the database was Renata's. I sat back in my chair, $38,000, one invoice, for a vendor I didn't recognize, approved while I was on leave for a region that fell under my operational oversight. I did not call Renata. I did not call my father. I called Marco, who was downstairs, and I said, "Come look at this." He looked. He read it twice. He looked at me. "How long have you been on leave?" 11 weeks. She added a new vendor in week 6. Yes, he pulled his chair close to mine. Search for any other invoices from this vendor. I searched. There were 3. June 3rd, $38,000. June 22nd, $44,500. July 12th, $51,200, all authorized by Renata, all marked as equipment and consumables for Northern Region Contract Fulfillment. $133,700, 11 weeks. Marco was quiet for a moment. Then he said very calmly, "You need to find out who owns Pacific Meridian." I did not look that night. I put Isabella to bed. I made dinner. I sat with Marco and we talked about it and did not talk about it, and I went to sleep with the numbers running quietly in the back of my mind like a program I hadn't closed. The next morning, when Isabella was napping and the house was still, I called a business attorney I had worked with on a contract dispute 2 years prior. Her name was Cecilia Nakamura, and she was one of the sharpest people I had ever sat across from in a professional setting. I said I needed a conversation, confidential, and I told her what I had found. Cecilia listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, "Before you go any further, you need to find out who owns that vendor entity." I told her I had thought the same thing. She said, "I can have my paralegal do a business entity search. Give me 48 hours. 48 hours later, she called me back. Pacific Meridian Supplies, LLC was registered in Delaware. It had been formed on May 27th of 2022, 12 days before I began my maternity leave. The registered agent was a corporate services company, standard enough, but the managing member of record was a name I recognized immediately. Fernanda Tavares. Fernanda Tavares was Renata's best friend since college. They had grown up together in the industry of our family's social world. Fernanda was the godmother of Renata's oldest son. They had dinner together every 2 weeks. They took a trip to Portugal together every other year. If Renata needed a business entity created to receive fraudulent payments from our family's company, Fernanda Tavares was exactly the person she would use. I sat in my home office for a very long time after that call. Isabella was in her bouncer next to my desk, looking at the mobile above her, occasionally reaching for the shapes that spun. She made a sound. I looked at her. I thought about the company my father had spent 22 years building. I thought about my mother, who had kept those books by hand in the early years, who had driven the accounting to a firm on Saturday mornings because she couldn't afford to do it any other way. I thought about the trust placed in my sister. I thought about the smile she had given me the last time I saw her. And then I started building my case. Here is what you need to understand about what came next. I did not panic. I did not confront anyone. I did not pick up the phone and call my father and say what I suspected. I had $133,700 of documented suspicious transactions and a corporate entity linked to my sister's closest friend. That was not nothing, but it was also not everything. And if I went nuclear with what I had, Renata could easily claim she had no knowledge of Fernanda's ownership, that the vendor had been recommended to her in good faith, that any errors were procedural. She would have time to cover her tracks. She would have time to construct a narrative. I was not going to give her that time. I was going to keep watching, and that was just the beginning. The second payment from Pacific Meridian came through on July 12th. The third came through 10 days after I returned from maternity leave in August, which told me something important. She had not stopped when I came back. She had continued. She had either decided she could keep going without detection, or she had made some calculation about risk versus reward and concluded the reward was worth it. That level of confidence is not something you develop overnight. It is something that grows in an environment of unchecked trust. I returned to the office on August 15th of 2022. Isabella was 4 months old. I had arranged for my mother-in-law to help with childcare for the first 3 months back, and Marco had adjusted his schedule to be home by 6 every evening. I walked back into Sousa Facilities Group with a smile on my face, a packed lunch, and a list in my head of every financial transaction I needed to examine without anyone knowing I was examining them. The thing about my role in operations is that it gave me a natural reason to look at almost anything. Cost per service hour on Northern Region contracts, operations concern, vendor performance and fulfillment rates on supply purchases, operations concern, any discrepancy between materials ordered and materials deployed, absolutely an operations concern. I had legitimate access to procurement data. I had legitimate reason to ask questions. What I needed to do was ask those questions in ways that didn't signal to Renata that I was looking at her. The first week back, I was warm and normal and welcoming in every interaction with my sister. I brought her coffee on Tuesday morning. I asked about her sons. I laughed at her jokes. I hugged her in the hallway and told her I had missed her, and I meant about 40% of that, which was the 40% of me that still held on to the person she had been before I knew what I knew. She, for her part, was warm and slightly louder than usual, the particular exuberance of someone who has been getting away with something and feels safe. On my 5th day back, Horacio knocked on my office door and closed it behind him. He sat down and looked at me steadily. Horacio had been with the company for 8 years, had worked under me for 4 of them, and was not a man who closed doors unless he had something serious to say. "I'm glad you're back," he said. "I want to tell you something, but I need you to understand that I don't have documentation for this yet." I folded my hands on my desk. "Go ahead." He told me he had noticed, over the summer, that supply deliveries for Northern Region contracts had been arriving short. Not massively short, but consistently 5 to 10% below invoiced quantities. He had flagged it twice with the office administrator, been told it was a receiving error and had let it go. But it had continued after I returned, and when he had pulled the delivery receipts against the invoices, the numbers didn't reconcile. I said calmly, "Which vendor?" He said, "Mostly one, Pacific Meridian." I held his gaze for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you, Horacio. Document everything you've seen. Keep it between us. If anyone asks why you're pulling delivery receipts, tell them it's an operations efficiency review." He nodded. He started to stand. "One more thing," I said. "Don't mention this to Renata." He looked at me for a second longer than necessary. Then he said, "I wasn't going to." That was my first ally confirmed. Over the next 3 weeks, I built a picture. Not a complete one, not yet, but a picture. Pacific Meridian had been paid a total of $162,420 between June and late September of 2022. Deliveries against those invoices, when reconciled against Horacio's field reports, accounted for perhaps 40% of the invoiced goods. The remaining 60%, goods paid for but not delivered, represented approximately $97,000 of payments for nothing. I want you to understand what I was looking at here. My sister was not just running a fraudulent vendor through our company's accounts. She was also stealing the money. The invoices were real invoices, the vendor was a real registered entity, but the goods were ghost deliveries. They existed on paper and not in the warehouses. Someone was pocketing the difference between what was invoiced and what was delivered, and that someone's best friend owned the vendor entity. I did not share this with Cecilia yet. I was still gathering. In late September, a new pattern appeared. I noticed that 3 of our oldest vendor accounts, relationships my father had maintained for over 15 years, had begun generating amended invoices. Small amendments in most cases, a line item adjustment here, a quantity correction there. The amendments were approved in the financial management system, and the approvals bore Renata's authorization code. The amendments, in every case, resulted in a higher payment to the vendor than the original invoice. I pulled 8 months of amended invoices across 12 vendor accounts. The overpayments totaled approximately $74,000. When I understood what I was seeing, an entirely separate channel from the Pacific Meridian scheme, I felt something cold move through me. This was not opportunism. This was not a panicked act or a moment of weakness. This was a system, a designed, layered, multi-channel system for draining money out of the company. Pacific Meridian for large ghost transactions. Vendor invoice amendments for steady, small bleeds, both operating simultaneously, both quietly authorized by the same person. That night, I put Isabella to bed and then stood in the shower for 20 minutes and thought about my sister at my kitchen table, holding my newborn daughter, saying that our father was thinking of bringing in a CFO. I thought about the timing of that conversation, 6 weeks into my leave, right in the middle of the Pacific Meridian transactions going through. She had been telling me something I realized now, not a warning, a distraction. She had wanted to plant a narrative about structural changes so that if I ever looked at the financial records, I might attribute anomalies to a transition period. She had been so far ahead of where I thought she was that the recognition of it took my breath. I got out of the shower, dried off, sat on the edge of the bed next to Marco, who was reading. He looked up. I said, "She built a system." He put his book down. I said, "This wasn't impulsive. She designed this." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How much?" I told him what I'd calculated so far. He looked at the ceiling for a second. Then he looked at me. Have you called Cecilia? Tomorrow, I said. He nodded. Tonight you sleep. I did not sleep particularly well, but I did sleep, which I considered a small victory. The next day I called Cecilia and gave her an update. She listened to all of it, the Pacific Meridian scheme, the invoice amendment pattern, the timeline from inception to current, and when I finished, she was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, Valentina, this is embezzlement. This is not a family dispute. This is a criminal matter. I said I understood that. She said, I want you to hear me clearly. You cannot confront her. You cannot tell your parents yet. Every move you make from this point forward needs to be documented and legally defensible. Do you understand? I said yes. She said, I'm going to refer you to a forensic accountant. His name is Teodoro Mancini. He's done this exact kind of work for family business cases before. I want him to look at everything you have and tell us definitively what the total exposure is. I said, how long will that take? She paused. If he starts now and you give him full access, 6 weeks, maybe 8, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. I thought about Renata walking into the office every morning, authorizing transactions, smiling at our father, holding the keys to the financial system with both hands. 6 more weeks. Schedule the meeting, I said. I met with Teodoro Mancini on a Thursday morning in October. He was a compact, precise man in his early 60s, the kind of person who made you feel immediately that chaos would not be tolerated in his vicinity. He had reading glasses he kept on a chain and a yellow legal pad that he covered in neat, small handwriting while I spoke. When I laid out everything I had, the Pacific Meridian documents, the invoice amendment data, the delivery reconciliation reports from Horacio, he looked at it all methodically, without visible reaction, for about 25 minutes. Then he took off his glasses and said, Tell me about the company's banking relationships. How many accounts? Who has signing authority? I told him 2 operating accounts, 1 payroll account, 1 capital reserve account. My father had signing authority on all 4. Renata had been added as a secondary signatory on the operating accounts 2 years prior, which was standard for her role. Teodoro said, I'm going to need full transaction histories on all 4 accounts going back 18 months. Can you arrange that access? I said I could. He said, one more question. Does your sister have any administrative access to the accounting system beyond her authorization level? I hesitated. I don't know. I'd assumed not, but I haven't verified it. He made a note. That's the first thing we verify. If she has elevated access, the scope of this could be considerably larger than what you've described. He was right. It was. 2 weeks into Teodoro's investigation, he called me on a weekday evening and asked me to come to his office. Not over the phone, not by email, in person. I drove there in 40 minutes, found him at his desk with 3 printed reports arranged side by side, and sat down across from him. He said, Your sister has administrator-level access to the accounting system. She was granted it approximately 14 months ago. I found a third channel. He walked me through it. Beyond the Pacific Meridian ghost invoices and the vendor amendment overpayments, Renata had been running payroll adjustments. Small, incremental adjustments to her own compensation and to a secondary payroll record, a ghost employee listed as a part-time contract administrator who had been receiving biweekly direct deposits for 16 months. The ghost employee's bank account routing number led to a personal account registered in the name of a family trust. The trustee on that account was Renata Souza. She had been paying herself twice for over a year. I sat in Teodoro's office for a moment without speaking. He let me sit, then I said, Total exposure, what are we looking at? He turned one of the reports around to face me. He had written the figure at the bottom in the same neat, small handwriting as everything else. It looked like any other number. It was $647,000 and some hundreds of dollars. I looked at it. I looked at him. He said, This is preliminary, pending full account reconciliation. The final number may be slightly higher. Slightly higher. I sat back in my chair. My sister who I had called at 2 in the morning when her marriage was dissolving. My sister who had held Isabella with such ease and love. $647,000 extracted from our family's company over the course of, I calculated it, 26 months, beginning well before my maternity leave, ending only because Teodoro was now looking at every transaction. I said, How long before you have a complete report? He said, 3 weeks. For at most, I said, I need it to be complete, airtight, every channel documented, every transaction sourced, every dollar traced. He said, That's what I do. I drove home in the dark and sat in the parking garage under our building for 11 minutes before I could make myself go upstairs, not because I was devastated, or rather, not only because of that, but because I was thinking about my father. About what this was going to do to Dario Souza, who had trusted his little executive completely, who had handed her the keys to the financial house and never once thought to check the locks. About what it would do to my mother, Yolanda, who had kept those books by hand in the early years and would feel this as a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed. And I was thinking about what I needed to do before that conversation happened, because this was not a conversation I was going to have unprepared. I was not going to walk into my father's office and say I think Renata stole money and watch my family fracture on suspicion alone. I was going to walk in with documentation so complete, so airtight that there would be nothing to question, nothing to dispute, no way to construct an alternative narrative. I was going to play the audit report, but first I had 3 weeks. And 3 weeks was enough time to build a fortress. During those 3 weeks, I lived 2 lives in parallel. At work, I was Valentina Souza Reyes, Director of Operations, back from maternity leave and as engaged and capable as ever. I attended every meeting. I responded to every email. I sat across from Renata in the weekly management briefing every Tuesday morning and listened to her present the financial summary and asked normal operational questions and held everything I knew behind a face that showed nothing. I was polite. I was sisterly. I asked about her sons once a week. I passed her in the kitchen and made small talk about clients and weather and the new contract in Hartford that my father was proud of. She had no idea. Outside of work, I was building. Cecilia had connected me not only with Teodoro, but with a second attorney, a litigator named Armando Figueiredo, who specialized in civil fraud cases involving family-owned businesses. Armando was tall, deliberate, and had the particular manner of a person who has seen every possible version of family betrayal and is no longer surprised by any of them. When I sat down with him for the first time, he looked at the preliminary numbers from Teodoro and said, "This is a strong civil case. Depending on how the criminal referral goes, it could also be a very strong restitution case." I said, "Walk me through the options." He did. Over 3 meetings across 2 weeks, Armando laid out the landscape. We could pursue a civil suit for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. We could file a criminal complaint with the state attorney's office, which would trigger a separate criminal investigation. We could do both simultaneously, which was the path he recommended if our goal was maximum accountability and full financial recovery. He said, "The civil case is about money. The criminal case is about what she did. What do you want?" I said, "I want both." He said, "Then we wait for Mancini's complete report and we file on the same day." I said, "Before or after I tell my parents?" He was quiet for a moment. "That's your decision, but I'll tell you this, the filing will become a matter of record. If you want your parents to hear this from you before they hear it from their attorney or from a process server, you have a narrow window." I thought about that. I thought about it for 3 days. On a Thursday evening, I put Isabella to bed and then sat at my kitchen table with Marco across from me and a glass of water I hadn't touched. I said, "I need to tell them before we file. I need them to hear it from me." Marco said, "When?" I said, "As soon as Teodoro's report is final." Marco reached across the table and put his hand over mine. He said, "You know this is going to break your father's heart." I said, "I know." He said, "And you know that doesn't make you wrong for doing it." I looked at him. I said, "I'm going to need you in that room with me." He said, "Obviously." That was the moment I loved him most in all of this. Not the strategy or the legal preparation or the documents. Just obviously, 2 days later, I had a close call that nearly dismantled everything. I was in the copy room at the end of the day, making copies of a subset of Teodoro's preliminary data. I kept nothing on company systems, everything on a personal encrypted drive when Renata appeared in the doorway. She did not knock. She leaned against the frame with her arms crossed and looked at me with an expression I did not immediately recognize. She said, "You've been quiet lately." I looked up from the copier. "I've been busy catching up." She said, "I mean different quiet, not catching up quiet." I set the papers I was holding face down on the copier and looked at her directly. This was the calculus I was always running in those weeks. Show nothing, but don't show that you're showing nothing. Worst thing would be to be too smooth, too controlled. Renata knew me well enough to read controlled as suspicious, so I let a little of the truth out, a small, true, unrelated truth. I said, "Honestly, I'm struggling with the transition back. Isabella's at home with Marco's mother and I'm here and I keep thinking about being in two places." I shrugged. "It's a mom thing, you know." Her expression shifted immediately, recognition, softening, the natural empathy of a woman who had also been a new mother. "Oh, Val," she pushed off the doorframe. "That's completely normal. It gets easier." "I know," I said. I picked up my papers, face still down, and shuffled them together casually. "I just need to get through the first few months." She gave me a look of genuine sisterly warmth and said, "If you need to work from home some days, just do it. Pappy won't mind." "Thank you," I said, and I meant a version of it. She left. I stood in the copy room alone for 30 seconds, breathing. Then I put everything in my bag and walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat and let my hands grip the steering wheel once tightly before releasing. She had been watching me. She had noticed something even if she couldn't name it. I needed the report. I needed to move. I called Teodoro from the car. I said, "How close are we?" He said, "I was going to call you tomorrow. It's done. I can have the bound report to you by end of day Friday." Friday was 2 days away. I said, "I'll be there." Then I called Cecilia and Armando in sequence and told them both. Friday, they confirmed they were ready. I drove home. I made dinner. I gave Isabella her bath. I read her a book she was too young to understand but listened to anyway, her eyes tracking the shapes of my face while I read, and I thought about what I was about to do to our family and whether there was any version of this that didn't require it. There was not. There was absolutely no version. The only question was how completely I had built the case. And the answer, I was almost certain, was completely enough. Teodoro handed me the bound report on a Friday morning. 93 pages, every transaction, every channel, every authorization, every reconciliation discrepancy. The ghost employee records, the Pacific Meridian invoices laid against delivery receipts, the vendor amendment overcharges spread across 3 years of relationship history. The final total, confirmed after full account reconciliation, $647,214. He put the report in my hands and said, "This is airtight." I looked at it. I looked at him. I said, "Thank you." He took his glasses off and held them. He said, "I've done this work for 25 years. I want to tell you something." I waited. He said, "Most people, when they find something like this, the first thing they do is react. They confront. They escalate before they're ready. They give the other person time to run." He paused. "You didn't do that. You're going to get justice because you were patient." I said, "I had a good reason to be patient." He said, "Yes, but it still takes something to hold it that long." I carried the report to my car. I sat in the driver's seat. I called Marco and said, "I have it. We're ready." He said, "When do you want to do it?" I said, "Monday." He said, "I'll clear my calendar." I said, "Tell your mother to plan to stay with Isabella for a few extra hours." He said, "Done." I put the phone down and sat there for a moment with the report on the passenger seat beside me. 93 pages, 14 months of patience. $647,214, every cent documented, every authorization traced, every lie mapped against the record. She had taken money from my parents, from the company they had built together, the machine my mother had held together by hand in the early years, the thing my father described at every family dinner like a living member of the family. She had taken it in dozens of small, careful moves while I was in a hospital bed. She had looked at the window my maternity leave created, and she had decided to climb through it. What she had not calculated was that the window would eventually close, that I would come back, that I would notice. That I had spent 14 years learning every part of that company, and that I would recognize the sound of something wrong the way you recognize the sound of your own house settling at night, familiar enough to know when something has changed. She had miscalculated me, comprehensively and entirely, and I had spent 14 months making sure that miscalculation cost her everything it deserved to cost. If you're still with me, stay, because what I did next is the reason I am telling you this story. Monday morning arrived like a held breath finally released. I woke before my alarm. Marco was already awake beside me, which told me he hadn't slept much either. We didn't talk about it. We had talked about it enough. We got up, we got dressed, we drank coffee while his mother arrived to be with Isabella, and then we drove to my parents' house separately because we had agreed that it was better if I arrived first alone and that Marco would come in once everyone was present. I had called my father Sunday evening. I had said I needed to meet with him and my mother Monday morning, that it was business, that it was important. He had said, of course, what time? I said 9 o'clock. He said, should Renata be there? I said no, not yet. There was a pause on the line. He said, Valentina, is everything all right? I said, we'll talk Monday. He said, okay. The word was careful. My father, who had built a company from a single contract and had survived 22 years of operational uncertainty, knew what a Monday morning meeting with just parents meant. He did not push. He waited. I arrived at 9 exactly. My mother had made coffee and arranged cups on the kitchen table, which she always did when there was something serious happening, the ritual of hospitality as armor against anxiety. She hugged me at the door, and I held her for a half-second longer than usual, and she pulled back and looked at my face, and something passed across her expression. A recognition, a readiness for something she could already feel coming. My father was at the head of the table. He looked at me steadily as I sat down. I placed the report on the table face down and folded my hands over it. I said, I need to tell you something about the company. I need you to hear all of it before you respond. I need you to let me get through all of it. My mother sat down. She put her hands around her coffee cup. My father said, go ahead. I turned the report over. And then methodically, patiently, the way Teodoro had taught me to think about data, I walked them through every single page. My father turned the first page slowly. My mother's hands stayed wrapped around her coffee cup. I watched my father's face as he moved through the executive summary Teodoro had prepared, one page, clear, structured, the totals at the bottom in bold. I had asked Teodoro to write it that way on purpose, not buried, not softened, right there at the bottom where you could not miss it. My father reached the bottom of the first page. He stopped. He looked up at me. Then he looked back down at the page. He set it on the table with the careful precision of a man who needed something to do with his hands. My mother said, Valentina, what is this? I said, let me walk you through it, all of it. Please let me get through all of it. My father nodded once. He turned to the next page. I spent 45 minutes walking them through the report. I went channel by channel, the way Teodoro had organized it. Pacific Meridian first, the vendor registration, the invoices, the delivery reconciliation discrepancies, the corporate entity search showing Fernanda Tavares as managing member. Then the vendor invoice amendments, 12 accounts, 3 years, $74,000 in systematic overpayments. then the ghost employee, the payroll record, the direct deposits, the family trust account registered to Renata. My father asked one question during the entire presentation. It came in the middle of the Pacific Meridian section, quietly. When was this company registered? I said, May 27th of 2022, 12 days before my maternity leave began. He looked at the page. He did not speak again for the rest of the presentation. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet. The coffee cups had gone cold. Sunlight moved across the table in the slow way it does in the late morning. My mother had not moved in 20 minutes. She was looking at a point slightly to the left of the report, her face doing something complicated and still. My father said, "How long have you known?" I said, "I became suspicious in July of 2022. I engaged a forensic accountant in October. His report was finalized Friday." A pause. The clock on the kitchen wall measured it. My father said, 14 months. "Yes," he said, "you carried this for 14 months. I said, "I needed to be certain. I needed to be complete. I needed you to have something you couldn't argue with." I paused. "I needed you to not have a reason to doubt me." My mother made a sound that was not quite a word. She stood up, walked to the kitchen window, and stood there with her back to us. I watched her shoulders and waited. My father said, "Is there a legal filing?" I said, "My attorneys are ready to file civil and criminal complaints simultaneously. They're waiting for my instruction." He said, "Civil and criminal." "Yes." He said the word criminal very quietly, like he was testing its weight. He had never had to use it about his own family before. I watched him absorb it. My mother turned from the window. Her face was composed in the way that takes tremendous effort to maintain. She said, "She has 2 children." I said, "I know." She said, "Dario." My father looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them that was 22 years of marriage compressed into 3 seconds. Then my father looked at me and said, "What do your attorneys recommend?" I said, "Full filing, civil and criminal, simultaneously. Today, if possible, given that she may become aware that the investigation has concluded." My father put his hand flat on the report. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "Do it." My mother made that sound again, that compressed, grieving syllable. My father said to her, not unkindly, "Yolanda, she stole from us. She stole from her sister. She stole from our employees' company health plan, which is one of the channels in here." He tapped the report. "She stole from people who have worked for us for 20 years. He looked at her steadily. "I will not protect her from the consequences of what she chose to do." My mother sat back down. She did not argue. I think she had known when she made the coffee that morning and arranged the cups that she was preparing for something she wouldn't be able to stop. I called Armando. I said, "File today." He said, "I'll have the civil complaint submitted within the hour. The criminal referral goes to the state attorney's office simultaneously. I'll call you when it's done." I said, "Thank you." Marco arrived 20 minutes later, as we had planned. He came in quietly, kissed my mother on the cheek, shook my father's hand, and sat down beside me. He did not say much. He poured himself a coffee and let the room be what it needed to be. I will always love him for that, for understanding that sometimes presence is more valuable than words. We sat in my parents' kitchen for another hour. We did not talk about Renata much. We talked about the company, about what needed to happen administratively, about Renata's access to the financial systems being revoked before end of day. My father called the company's IT administrator from the kitchen table. He was professional and quiet, and his voice did not shake. When he hung up, he looked at the wall for a moment, then looked at me and said, "What happens next?" I said, "She'll be served. Then she'll have a decision to make." He said, "And if she fights it?" I said, "Then the report goes before a judge and a jury." He nodded. He looked at the report, which was still open on the table. He closed it. I did not know at that moment that Renata would not wait to be served, that her attorney, a man named Bruno Castellan, who came highly recommended and charged accordingly, would contact Armando within 48 hours of the filing with a proposal for a private mediation. I did not know that Renata had apparently been expecting something like this for some time and had a response strategy already in place. The speed of her response when it came told me things about her I had not fully understood before, that she had known she was exposed. Maybe not the full scope, but she had known something was coming and she had prepared. Bruno Castellan called Armando on a Wednesday morning, 2 days after the filing. He was professional and measured and said that his client wished to explore a resolution that would avoid the criminal process, protect the family, and make the company whole. He used phrases like full cooperation and good faith restitution and family unity. Armando listened to all of it and then called me. He said, "She wants to mediate. Her attorney is pitching this as voluntary restitution in exchange for us withdrawing the criminal referral." I said, "What's your read?" Armando said, "She's scared of the criminal exposure. A conviction on embezzlement at this level is a felony. She's looking at serious prison time if this goes to trial." I said, "What do you recommend?" He was quiet for a moment. "Attend the mediation, listen to what they offer, don't show your hand, and let me do most of the talking." I said, "I want to be in the room." He said, "I know you will be." I said, "And I want her in the room." Another pause. "She'll be there." I said, "Good." The mediation was scheduled for the following Monday, at a neutral location, a conference room at a law firm in downtown Newark that neither side had any relationship with. Armando and I arrived 15 minutes early. Cecilia came as well because the civil filing was hers and because I wanted every attorney I had in that room. Teodoro was on standby by phone, available to answer technical questions about the forensic report if needed. I wore a dark blazer and no jewelry except my wedding ring, which I had put on that morning with more awareness than usual, not as decoration but as armor. I had slept well the night before. Marco had made breakfast. Isabella had grabbed my finger at the kitchen table and laughed at nothing, the way babies laugh, and I had held her small hand and thought, she's the reason I came back to work. She's the reason I noticed. She's the reason this matters. Renata arrived with Brino Castellan and, to my surprise, their mother, my mother, Yolanda Souza, who had called me 3 times the week before, each time arriving at the same place, she is still your sister. I had said each time, I know. I had not said what I felt, which was that sisterhood is not a blank check, that love does not erase $647,000 of deliberate theft. Renata walked in wearing a gray dress I had not seen before, composed in a way that told me she had worked hard at the composure, that it was not natural. She sat across from me and looked at the table. She had not looked at me directly since I entered the room. Our mother sat beside her and looked at me with an expression I cannot fully describe, somewhere between love and accusation, which is a particular specialty of mothers in impossible situations. Brino Castellan opened. He was smooth and structured and presented Renata's position with the confidence of someone who had prepared extensively. The position, in summary, Renata acknowledged irregularities in several transactions. She attributed them primarily to poor judgment, inadequate supervision, and a period of personal financial stress following her divorce. She was prepared to enter into a restitution agreement for the full amount as calculated in the forensic report. In exchange, she asked for the criminal referral to be withdrawn and for the civil complaint to be converted to a private settlement agreement. I sat perfectly still through this. My hands were on the table. My face was neutral. When Brino finished, Armando looked at him for a moment and then said pleasantly, "We appreciate the proposal. We'd like to hear directly from your client about her acknowledgement of the specific transactions outlined in the forensic report." Brino said, "My client has acknowledged irregularities," Armando said, still pleasantly. "The forensic report identifies 3 distinct fraudulent channels across a period of approximately 26 months, representing $647,214 in documented theft from Souza Facilities Group. We'd like to hear your client acknowledge those specific channels on the record in this mediation." A pause. Brino leaned toward Renata and they exchanged a whispered consultation. I watched Renata during this. She was looking at the table. Her hand was resting near her water glass and she was not touching it, but her fingers were very slightly bent, like she was bracing for something she knew was coming. Renata lifted her head and looked directly at Armando. Her voice was level. "I acknowledge the transactions identified in the report." Armando said, "All 3 channels?" Another beat. "Yes," Armando said, "including the ghost employee payroll record depositing into a family trust account in your name." Her jaw tightened. "Just barely." "Yes," Armando said. "Thank you." He made a note. "We'll continue." What happened over the next 2 hours was a negotiation, and I will tell you what I had decided before I walked into that room. I was going to let them believe they were winning. Brino Castellan was intelligent and experienced, and he had prepared a comprehensive restitution framework that included a payment schedule, a non-disclosure provision, and a clause requiring Renata to resign from the company. He presented it as generous because it included no admission of criminal intent, only the acknowledgement of irregularities. He presented it with the smooth confidence of someone who had done this before and expected it to be accepted. I let Armando negotiate the terms while I sat quietly and observed. I watched Renata's body language. I watched her touch the water glass finally, take one small sip, set it down. I watched her glance once at our mother, who was sitting with her hands folded, radiating a hope so fragile it was almost painful to see. At one point, Brino said, with a directness aimed at me rather than Armando, "Valentina, I think we can all agree that the goal here is to make the company whole and preserve the family as much as possible. A criminal proceeding helps no one." I looked at him. I said calmly, "I want to make sure the agreement is complete." He said, "We can make it very complete." I said, "I'd like to add a provision." Brino's expression remained neutral, but I caught the micro shift, the slight recalibration that happened when an opposing party introduces something unexpected. "Of course," I said, "I'd like the agreement to include an acknowledgement that the conduct described constitutes embezzlement under New Jersey statute, and that this acknowledgement may be used in any subsequent legal proceeding if the terms of this agreement are not fulfilled." Renata looked up. For the first time since we'd sat down, she looked directly at me. I held her gaze steadily. Brino said, "That's a significant provision." I said, "It's a standard provision in restitution agreements involving documented fraud." Armando, bless him, did not react. He simply wrote something on his pad, which I could see from the corner of my eye was a small check mark. Brino and Renata exchanged another consultation, this one longer. I could not hear it. I watched our mother during it, watched her look from Renata to Brino to me, watched the hope in her face doing battle with something more realistic. Brino straightened. Client will accept that provision, with the understanding that the criminal referral is formally withdrawn upon execution of the agreement and first payment installment. I said, agreed. Armando said, we'll need the first installment to be a minimum of $150,000 payable within 30 days of execution. Brino looked at me rather than Armando. He said, that's a very short timeline. I said, your client had 26 months to accumulate the funds. 30 days is generous. Renata made a sound, not quite a word, something compressed and sharp, and stopped herself. Brino said, we can agree to that timeline. He shuffled his papers. Then I think we have the framework of an agreement. What I did not tell Brino Castellan or Renata was this: I had no intention of withdrawing the criminal referral based on a framework. Armando and I had discussed this in detail the week before. A mediation framework is not a binding agreement. The criminal referral would remain active until the formal agreement was signed, notarized, and the first payment had cleared. And the formal agreement, the one Armando would draft, would include provisions that Brino's framework had not anticipated, specifically around the acknowledgement language I had just established. If Renata failed to meet any single payment deadline, the acknowledgement of embezzlement would convert automatically into a criminal referral that could not be withdrawn under any circumstances. The trap was not in refusing to settle. The trap was in making the settlement terms so airtight that any failure on her part triggered consequences more severe than the original complaint. Brino believed we had reached a framework. Renata believed she was getting out of this with a payment plan and her freedom. I signed the mediation summary sheet with steady hands, not trembling. I had considered performing the tremble. Armando had actually suggested it during our prep, said sometimes it helps to let the other side feel they've broken you, but I had decided against it, because I was not broken, and because I wanted Renata to know when she looked at me across that table that I was not broken. I wanted her to understand exactly who she had underestimated. She looked at me as I signed. Her expression was complicated relief, I thought, and something else underneath it. Something that looked, if I read it correctly, like the first acknowledgement that she had lost something much larger than this negotiation. She had lost the version of our relationship that was possible before she chose to do what she did. She knew it. I saw her know it. I capped my pen. I slid the sheet across the table. Brino said, I think this is a very constructive outcome. I said, we'll see. He looked at me for a half second, and I could tell that half second troubled him. Good. My mother touched my arm as we stood to leave. She said very quietly, thank you for letting her explain. I looked at her. I said, she didn't explain, Mom. She acknowledged there's a difference. My mother's hand dropped. I kissed her cheek because I did love her, and I walked out. In the elevator, Armando looked at me and said, the acknowledgement provision was brilliant. I said, I learned from watching you. He shook his head slightly, smiling. You knew exactly what you were doing before you sat down. I said, yes. He said, the draft agreement will have everything we discussed. If she misses one installment, I said, I know. He said, she doesn't know what she signed onto. I said, no, she doesn't. The elevator doors opened. We walked into the lobby of the building, and the November air came through the revolving door, sharp and cold and real, and I stood in it for a moment and thought about my father closing that report on the kitchen table. I thought about what he had said, 14 months, and I thought, not yet. We were not finished yet, because Renata had agreed to a framework, not a binding document. And Brino Castellan, skilled as he was, had not yet seen what the binding document contained. He thought she'd settled. In 48 hours, he'd know the difference between a framework and a trap. The formal agreement came back to Brino on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 days after the mediation. Armando told me that evening that he had received a call from Brino at 5:40 in the afternoon, and that the call had lasted 41 minutes, and that Brino's voice had changed measurably between the beginning of the call and the end. Armando called me from his car after. He called the acknowledgement language substantially broader than what was discussed. I said, is it broader? Armando said, it is entirely consistent with what was explicitly agreed to in the mediation. I said, then what's the issue? He said, the issue is that Brino expected us to draft something that protected his client's ability to walk away cleanly. We drafted something that protects the company's ability to pursue all available remedies if she defaults. There's no ambiguity. I said, what did you tell him? Armando said, I told him the language reflected exactly what was agreed to in the mediation, that we had the signed summary sheet, and that we were prepared to proceed to full litigation if the formal agreement was not executed within 14 days. A pause. I said, and Armando said, he said he needed to consult with his client. I said, of course he does. 3 days later, Brino called back and said his client would execute the agreement. The formal execution was scheduled for a Friday morning at Armando's offices with a notary present. I was there. Renata was there. Brino sat beside her with the neutrality of a professional doing an unpleasant but necessary job. He had stopped trying to negotiate the language. He had reviewed it, understood it, explained it to his client, and his client had made the calculation that execution was preferable to full litigation with a 93-page forensic report as the plaintiff's primary exhibit. Renata picked up the pen. Her hand did not shake, which I respected. She was many things, but she was not weak. She signed each page with the same deliberate pressure, and when she reached the final page, the acknowledgement of embezzlement, the automatic criminal referral trigger, the payment schedule with 0 grace period, she paused for 1 second. Then she signed. The notary stamped the document. Brino collected his copy. Armando collected ours. The room was quiet, with the specific quiet of a thing that is done. I said nothing. I had nothing to say. The document said everything. We filed out of the conference room and into the hallway, and Renata stopped beside me for a moment. She did not look at me. She looked straight ahead at the wall. She said very quietly in Portuguese, the language we had grown up speaking at home. I told myself it was just temporary, that I would put it back. I stood beside her for a moment. I thought about what to say. I thought about the person I had been before I knew what I knew. I thought about the 2 in the morning phone calls and the Portugal trips and the kitchen coffee and the hand on my arm in the maternity ward. I said, also in Portuguese, you didn't put it back, Renata. She said nothing. I said, you had 26 months to put it back. I walked past her and into the elevator. Armando followed. The doors closed. He looked straight ahead and said nothing. I looked straight ahead and said nothing. The elevator descended, and somewhere above us my sister stood in a hallway with a document she had just signed, and I let myself feel, for the first time in 14 months, the full weight of what it had cost me to get there. Not just the preparation, not just the months of parallel lives and careful silence and strategic patience. The cost of knowing. Cost of carrying a truth about your own family and having to hold it in every interaction, every Tuesday morning meeting, every kitchen hallway passing, every how are the boys phone call. That cost is not nothing. It sits in you and you carry it, and you do not put it down until you are finished. I was finished. I walked out of the building. Marco was waiting in the car. I got in. He looked at me. I said, it's signed. He said, how do you feel? I thought about it. I said, like I can breathe again. He put the car in drive. We picked up Isabella from Marco's mother's house, and I held her in the back seat all the way home, her small head against my shoulder, her weight familiar and absolute. She smelled like the lotion Marco's mother used, a lavender smell, and I held her and did not think about the mediation or the document or the acknowledgement provision. I just held her, but I was not finished, because the formal agreement, for all its enforceability, was a private document. The people who had witnessed 14 months of Renata's conduct, our extended family, the company staff, the board of advisors my father had assembled over the years, none of them knew what had happened. And Renata, I had learned, had been telling a version of events in the weeks since the filing. Nothing explicit, nothing that could be characterized as false on its face, but a version, a framing. Armando had heard from a contact that she had been describing the situation as a family dispute over business decisions, that there had been a falling out, that Valentina had always been difficult. Difficult. I had heard that word before. It was a word my family used when they meant too much, too precise, too structured, too willing to name things that others preferred to leave unnamed. I was going to name everything. My father called me 2 weeks after the signing. He said he wanted to address the full board of advisors, which met quarterly, and that the next meeting was in 3 weeks. He said he thought it was right for the record to be complete, for people who had worked with the company to understand what had happened and what had been done about it. I said, I agree. He said, I'd like you to present the report. I said, I'll be ready. The board meeting was held in the company's main conference room at the headquarters in Union, New Jersey, a room I had walked through hundreds of times, sat in dozens of times, and never thought about as a stage until now. The board consisted of 9 advisors, a mix of long-standing business contacts, an attorney who served in a governance capacity, and 2 former clients who had transitioned into advisory roles as the company grew. Most of them had known my father for 15 years or more. Several of them had watched me grow up within the company, had asked about my MBA, had congratulated me on my return from maternity leave. They did not know about any of this. My father opened the meeting as he always did, formally, with the quarterly numbers and a review of current contract performance. He was composed in a way I recognized as deliberate, the same way I had been composed in that mediation room. He had been practicing this. He had decided who he was going to be in this room, and he was being it. Then he looked around the table and said, before we continue to the advisory items, I need to address a matter of serious concern to the company that has been resolved through legal proceedings. I'm going to ask my daughter Valentina to present the relevant information. 9 people around the table oriented toward me. Some of them I knew well. Marcus Osai, the governance attorney, who had a habit of clicking his pen when he was processing something difficult. Dina Reinhold, who had been a client before she became an advisor, and who had sharp eyes that didn't miss much. Fernando Lego, who had worked with my father since the early years and whose loyalty to the company was, I knew, genuine and profound. I placed the executive summary of Teodorov's report in front of each of them. I had prepared a version redacted of certain personal family details, names specifically at Cecilia's recommendation that described the conduct, the channels, the amounts, and the remediation. I said, I'm going to walk you through this. Please hold your questions until I've finished. And I walked them through it, the same way I had walked my parents through it in their kitchen, except this time I had 14 months of practice carrying it and my voice was steady from the first sentence to the last. I described the vendor fraud. I described the invoice amendment channel. I described the ghost employee. I described the total, $647,214. I described the forensic investigation, the legal filings, the mediation, the executed agreement, and the payment schedule now in force. I described it all calmly in sequence, the way you describe a problem that has been identified and contained and addressed, not as a tragedy, as an operational matter, as what it was. When I finished, the room was quiet. Marcus Osa had stopped clicking his pen. Dina Reinhold was looking at the executive summary with an expression that was reading the document and making her own calculations. Fernando Lego was looking at my father with something in his face that was not quite pity and not quite anger and was perhaps the feeling you have when you have loved something for a very long time and learned it could be hurt. Marcus Osa spoke first. He said, the executed agreement, does it include the acknowledgement provision as a contingency trigger? I said, it does. He said, good. He set his copy of the summary down. That was the right structure. Dina Reinhold said, the forensic report Mancini did this work. I said, yes. She said, I've seen his work before. If he signed off on this, the numbers are final. I said, they are. Fernando Lego looked at me across the table. He said quietly, how long did you carry this? I said, 14 months from initial discovery to the board being informed. He looked at my father. My father held his gaze. Fernando said to my father, she did right by this company. My father said, she always does. I want to tell you what that meant to me. I had spent 14 years in that company being the workhorse and watching my sister be the executive. I had spent 14 years doing the operational work that held the machine together while someone else got the compliments at dinner. I had spent 14 months carrying a truth that could have broken the family if I had dropped it wrong, and I had held it carefully and done everything correctly and brought it to this room in a form that could not be disputed. And my father had said, she always does. That sentence in that room in front of those people, that was the moment. Not the report, not the filed complaint, not the signed agreement, that sentence, because it was true, because he knew it was true, and because it had taken $647,000 and 14 months and a 93-page forensic report for it to be said out loud. But then the room moved, because this was not the end. Dina Reinhold said, I want to flag something. Her voice was careful. The board needs to discuss the internal controls that allowed this to go undetected. This is not about assigning blame beyond what's been addressed. This is about making sure it cannot happen again. My father said, agreed, that's on this meeting's agenda. She said, I'd recommend a full audit of authorization structures. No single person should have the combination of access levels that permitted this pattern to develop. I said, I've already drafted a proposal for a segregated authorization structure. I can present it as part of the controls discussion. Dina looked at me. She said, of course you have, not sarcastically, like she was confirming a thing she had already suspected. The controls discussion lasted 40 minutes. I presented the authorization structure proposal. Marcus Osa reviewed it in real time, asked 4 specific questions, and recommended 2 refinements that I agreed were improvements. Fernando Lego raised the question of an independent financial review on a semi-annual basis. My father agreed immediately. When the meeting concluded, Fernando Lego caught me in the hallway. He was a large man with the kind of physical stillness that belongs to people who have been in hard rooms and learned that movement signals anxiety. He put one hand on my arm and said, your father's going to need some time. I said, I know. He said, he's not angry at you, he's grieving. I said, I know that too. He said, what you did took courage, not just the investigation. The 14 months of showing up while knowing that kind of discipline. He paused. Most people can't hold it. I said, I had a good reason to hold it. He said, your daughter, I said, the company, my parents, everything they built. A pause. And yes, my daughter too. She deserved to grow up knowing her mother doesn't fold. Fernando looked at me for a moment. Then he said, she will. He walked back into the conference room. I stood in the hallway alone for about 30 seconds and let myself feel the thing I had not let myself feel in 14 months. The specific bone-deep relief of a person who has been holding something very heavy and has finally been allowed to set it down. Then I went back to work. Renata made the first payment, $150,000, on the 28th day of the 30-day window. Armando called me when it cleared and said, first installment received. I said, good. He said, she's going to make these payments, Valentina. She's too scared not to. I said, I know. He said, the criminal referral stays active through the full payment schedule. I said, every single day until the last dollar clears. Renata did not fight the payment schedule. The agreement required quarterly installments over 3 years, with the acknowledgement trigger remaining active throughout. The second installment came through on schedule. The third installment came through on schedule. Each time Armando called me and said the number, I acknowledged it and went back to what I was doing. It was not that the money didn't matter. It mattered to the company, to the health plan accounts that had been shorted, to the employees whose benefits had been quietly underfunded by someone they never suspected. It mattered to my parents who were in the process of the accounting of their own grief and would need time that no payment schedule could accelerate. It mattered as justice. It mattered as record, but it was not the thing. The thing was something else entirely. The thing was a Tuesday morning in March of 2023, 4 months after the board meeting, when I sat down at my desk at Sousa Facilities Group and looked at the operations dashboard and saw clean numbers. Accurate numbers. Numbers that reflected what the company actually was, not what was being quietly drained away from it. Clean accounts, real vendors, real deliveries, real payroll, the machine running at its actual capacity, not being bled while it ran. That was the thing. That morning, I made a cup of coffee and stood at the window of my office, which looked out over the parking lot and the building across the street, and I thought, this is what I was protecting. This is what 22 years of my parents' work looks like when nobody is taking from it. This unremarkable Tuesday morning with clean numbers and a full staff schedule and contracts performing and not a single transaction I needed to trace. I thought about Isabella at home with the babysitter, learning to pull herself up on the furniture, making the sounds that would eventually become words. I thought about what I would tell her someday about this when she was old enough, not the details. The principle that the people who love you can make choices that hurt you, and that you are allowed to respond to those choices honestly, and that honesty is not the same thing as cruelty, and that protecting the things you care about is not the same thing as revenge. I was not sure I had the words for it yet, but I had time. There are some final things I need to tell you about what happened to everyone in this story, because I believe you deserve a complete picture. Renata completed the payment schedule over 3 years. Every installment on time without default. The criminal referral was withdrawn upon receipt of the final payment in accordance with the agreement. She was not prosecuted. She resigned from the company as a condition of the agreement. Fernanda Tavares, whose name appeared on the Pacific Meridian entity registration, was identified in a civil cross-complaint that resulted in a separate judgment against her for her participation in the fraud. She settled for $42,000. Pacific Meridian Supplies LLC was dissolved. Renata does not work in finance anymore. She is, as of the last I heard, working in a retail management capacity. We have not spoken except through attorneys since the day she stood beside me in that hallway and said she told herself she was going to put it back. I do not hate her. I have thought about that word hate, and it does not fit. What I feel is more like the space where a thing used to be, an absence that has its own shape. I know that shape now, and I do not need to fill it. My father retired from the active management of Sousa Facilities Group 18 months after the board meeting. He promoted me to Chief Executive Officer and named Horacio Vega as Chief Operating Officer, which was exactly right. Horacio had earned it 8 times over. My father still comes in 2 mornings a week. He drinks coffee in the conference room and reads the quarterly reports and occasionally makes suggestions, and most of his suggestions are good. The company's revenue the year following the resolution was the highest in its 24-year history. I believe that is because we stopped leaking. My mother and I took some time. There were months when our conversations were careful in a way they had not been before, both of us navigating around the thing we had both been forced to name. But she is my mother. She knows who her daughters are, all of them with full clarity now, and she has made her own peace with that knowledge in her own way. Last spring, she came to my house for Isabella's 2nd birthday, and she brought a cake from the bakery my grandmother used to use, and we stood in my kitchen, and she put her hand on my face the way she has done since I was a child, and she said, "You did right, that was all, but it was everything. Marco and I bought a house in Montclair last year. It has a yard with a maple tree that turns extraordinary colors in October. Isabella calls it the red tree and drags us outside to look at it regularly, at hours when we would rather be inside. We look at it. It is worth looking at. I am 38 years old. I run a company that my father built and that I intend to run for the next 20 years. I have a daughter who is learning to be fierce and curious simultaneously, which is the most important combination I can think of. I have a husband who said obviously when I needed him to. I have an attorney named Armando Figueiredo, who I will recommend to anyone who needs him. I have a forensic accountant named Teodoro Mancini who handed me a 93-page report and said, "This is airtight. I have done right by the things I was entrusted with. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. Here is what I know from the other side of all of this. You are not obligated to be quiet about what is being done to you. Patience is a strategy, not a surrender. Building your case before you make your move is not weakness. It is the thing that makes the move matter. The people who underestimate you are giving you something. Take it, use it. Do the work that they are certain you are not doing, and then show them exactly what that work produced. If this story found you at a moment when you are carrying something heavy and waiting for the right time, I want you to know that the right time is a thing you build, not a thing you wait for. Hit that like button if this story reached you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a comment below. Tell me your city. Tell me you're still here. Tell me what you're building. I read every single one.